I'll just take a minute to get the tech up to speed. There we go. Okay, now I need to do one more operation. There we go. Thank you for the privilege of speaking here this morning. I appreciate it, and I take it seriously. On the way in this morning, Steve King said to me, thank you for speaking this morning. And I said to him, I hope you'll be thankful when I'm finished. In fact, I hope you'll be not only thankful, but have some new meat to encourage you and strengthen you as you walk with Jesus on this path that is our lives. Before I do anything else, I'd like for God's mercy and pray that the evil plans that the devil has, because he always has evil plans, and war is one of the ways in which he accomplishes his greatest goal, which is to kill people. And many people are dying in this war. So please be praying that in spite of all this evil that's going on, God's purposes will be accomplished. That's the end of the announcement. Now, let's look at the Matroshka, remembering to pray for people in Ukraine, but let's look more closely. If you take a Matroshka apart, you find another Matroshka, slightly smaller inside. And if you keep going with this particular one, which is part of what my kids call my Russian icon at home, because I have a bunch of Matroshkas on a shelf, you end up with something like this, in this particular one, which is a very special Matroshka, and the little one is very tiny. But I want to ask the question, is the Bible in some way like a Matroshka? You take a Matroshka and you open it and you find another, you find something else inside, and you can find Matroshkas that are all different inside. Each one is different as well. I think the Bible is in some ways like a Matroshka. First of all, we have the Bible, which we look at as a book. But it's not just a book, it's a library. It's a collection of 66 books written over, covering a period of well over 1,000 years. Many different personalities, many different stories, many different themes. There's even something that my First Nations friends take very seriously called a treaty. We call it in a theology generally a covenant, but it's really a treaty. God makes two different treaties with his people in the Bible. So we find treaties in the Bible. We find among these books some very interesting collections of things, and the Psalms is one of those collections. So it's a collection within a collection within a collection. And within the Psalms, you find special collections, one of which I want to look at today. And in those collections, in the collection I'm going to look at today, there are even some special themes within that collection, within the collection of Psalms, and so on and so on. So the Bible is, in some ways, like a Matroshka. You open it and you dig more, and you find more and more things, and the more you dig, the more you find, and the more you find, the more you dig, and the more you find. Now, I did something with my mouse I shouldn't have done. Better leave the mouse alone. So what I want to look at today is a special collection within the Psalms called the Psalms of Ascent. I started looking at them about 2 years ago. I have so many notes now on the Psalms of Ascent that I decided not to print them because I'd have this big pile of papers and I'd be fiddling through it and trying to find what I wanted to sort out from all the things that I've learned about the Psalms of Ascent. And I'm just beginning to dig into them. But the Psalms of Ascent are psalms for the people of Israel to sing as they are going up to Jerusalem. Going to Jerusalem is called ascending to Jerusalem. Why would that be? Well, if you know the geography of Israel, you know that the hill country is many, many hills. It's in some ways reminds me of the eastern townships. If you took all the hills in the eastern townships and crammed them into just a tiny little space, it's just you're going up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down all the time. So when we talk about Jesus leaving Jerusalem and going to Galilee, it wasn't just a leisurely stroll. It was up and down and round the mountains and up and down over the mountains. It was a hard walk. And Jerusalem was on one of these hills. And how many of you been to Jerusalem? Okay, a few of you have. When you see Jerusalem today, you do not see Jerusalem the way the Old Testament people saw it, because at least twice the city has been totally destroyed and all the rubble has been thrown into the valleys around the original hill that was Jerusalem, so that Jerusalem is now more or less a level place. But back in the Old Testament times, Jerusalem was a fortress city on top of a steep hill. So it was quite different. And to go to Jerusalem, you ascended. And that's what these psalms are. These are songs that the people of Israel sang as they were going to Jerusalem for their 3 annual feasts. So what we see here is we see the people of God preparing to meet God. So these psalms have a special significance because they're not just psalms about anything. They're psalms about the people of God, what condition they are in as they are preparing to meet God. And there's a variety of things that we see. Now, this is one perspective on modern Jerusalem where you get the feeling of ascent. This is one of the walls of modern Jerusalem, but this is not the walls that were there in David's time and in the Old Testament time. These were walls built by the Turks. So present-day Jerusalem is on top of several meters of rubble, and the Jerusalem of Jesus' time is way under the rubble somewhere. One of the things you run into is a variety of emotions. If you just flip through these Psalms, there's 15 of them, starting at Psalm 120 to 134. The first Psalm talks about being troubled. I took my troubles to God. The second Psalm, 121, the person is asking the question, where do I get help? I need help. Where do I get it? The third one talks about being glad. The fourth one talks about someone crying out for mercy. And you see the people of God happy, sad, depressed, anxious, concerned, frustrated because they haven't seen God's mercy and when they were expecting it. In fact, you see the whole range of human emotions in these people as they prepare to go to Jerusalem to meet God. Now, you might say, so what? Well, I told you I've been studying these things now for a couple of years, and last winter when I was teaching one of my classes with the Indigenous learning community that I work with, I mentioned this to the class, and one of the students in the class said, wow, that's amazing. And so I asked, and the other students asked, well, what's so amazing about that? And she said, well, I grew up in a church where people told me that a Christian was always something or other, always in a certain emotional state. And her particular church was a Pentecostal charismatic kind of church, and believe me, I'm not criticizing them. I work a lot in charismatic and Pentecostal circles and have great respect for them. But one of the things she was taught was that a Christian is always la 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 la. Everybody is always happy and dancing and singing, and if you're not a good Christian. Well, the Psalms of Ascent tell us, no, that's not true. The people of God, preparing to go and meet God, are in all different kinds of emotional states. Now, somebody might be feeling critical, let's just say. When I've spoken in the church in the past, I've gotten a number of different types of feedback. Some of them are encouraging, some of them are critical. And the one critical thing that really stuck with me is the following. Someone said to me, look, when you get up to preach, you're always talking about ideas. Why don't you just tell us what to do? You ever feel that way? I think we all do at times, don't we? It'd be much nicer if you just told us what to do. Forget all these ideas. Just tell us what to do. Well, I thought about that quite a bit in preparing for this. And I realized I don't believe God does that with us. He doesn't always tell us what to do. And I'm going to get back to that in a little while. But please accept that as a fact for now. And if you're tempted to turn off, because I'm not going to tell you what to do, I am going to tell you what to do. Okay? There's a tell you what to do hidden somewhere in this teaching this morning. I'm not going to tell you where, because I want you to be attentive the whole time, all right? So, but there is a very direct tell you what to do in here. In fact, there's two of the most direct tell you what to do's I've ever seen in the Bible hidden in the Psalms of Ascent. And we're going to talk about one of them today. So, oops, if it's too many ideas, I'm not really apologizing. It's just a reminder for me to make my excuse. So we have a variety of emotions in the Psalms of Ascent. What about just Jerusalem? They're getting ready to go to Jerusalem. Now, we don't know who wrote all of these Psalms. We know that David wrote 4 of them, and Solomon wrote 1 of them. So that's 5 out of the 15. And we know that 1 of them was written after the return from exile, because it says in Psalm 126, when we returned from exile, we were crazy with joy. Well, there's the Pentecostal charismatic side. So 1 of the Psalms was written after the exile. So there's a period of several hundred years during which these Psalms could have been written. When were they collected? Well, we don't know. Maybe they were collected over time. Maybe the collection was added to over time. But we know that it wasn't finished, at least until the return from the exile. Now imagine, you're a Jew, and you've come back from the exile. Now, the exile was 70 years in a foreign city. You were driven out of Jerusalem. The city of Jerusalem was leveled. Now, Jerusalem was a key place for the Jews. Of David's 4 Psalms in this collection of the Psalms of Ascent, 2 of them talk about Jerusalem. Now, why would David be excited about Jerusalem? Any idea? You know, you don't find this in the Old Testament the way you think you would. Joshua, went into the promised land and conquered the promised land, right? Well, guess what? He didn't conquer Jerusalem. There was a people group there called the Jebusites who were too strong. And so this little Jebusite city and the villages around remained independent. And Joshua's account doesn't tell us that. Maybe they didn't tell us that because that was the bad part of the story they didn't want to tell. I don't know. But we do read, when we read David's life, that David finally conquered Jerusalem and the Jebusites. So David was the hero. Finally, this one fortress city, this tremendously powerful place in the middle of the country, was finally conquered. So David, 2 of his 4 Psalms talk about Jerusalem and his joy over Jerusalem and the fact that this is a place where God has chosen to dwell and be among his people. So we understand in David's time why David would be excited about Jerusalem. How about after the exile? You've been separated from Jerusalem. The city has been destroyed. You're in exile. The city of God is no longer there. You're in the city of some pagan nation. And by God's mercy, you're allowed to return, and you're allowed to begin to rebuild the city and to rebuild the temple. Imagine how amazing that would be. So, for the post-exilic Jews who were singing these Psalms of Ascent, they'd be thrilled to be back in Jerusalem. But they'd have some questions. How important is Jerusalem, really? Should we be so excited about Jerusalem that Jerusalem replaces who knows what? Similar questions to what we might expect. It comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. That question is settled very clearly for the people in the Psalms of Ascent. But I said now that I didn't think God always tells us what to do. I think what God does sometimes is he puts lines on the road for us, just like we're used to when we're driving a car, right? When you drive your car, do you drive on the lines? I hope not. every once in a while, you find yourself on the lines and you realize, oops, I'm in the wrong place, right? Now, if you drive on the right-hand line in this picture with the guardrail fairly close, there could be a pedestrian there and you could have a fatality. Or it could be me on my bike, because I'm often on my bike on the roads and hoping that the cars are going to go around me and not drive too close to the line, because I drive my bike along the line. The lines are there so that we can navigate between them. Just think of one of the sets of teaching in the Bible that's like this. God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and He predestines. He has a plan before the foundation of the world, and we have responsible, free choice. Those two things don't go together. They're like the North Pole and the South Pole in a magnet. You can't put them together. They just push each other apart. And we're not supposed to drive on either one of those lines. A good Christian life is lived by navigating between those lines. If you go too far to the one side, everything depends on me. Self-sufficient me, I can take care of everything. And if we go to the other extreme, God's in charge of everything. Why should I do anything? God's already got it all planned. He's going to do it. I can't change a thing. Both of those are wrong. And a fruitful Christian life is lived by navigating between the lines and avoiding the extremes. And I think a lot of what God teaches us in the Bible is like that. Partly because we are dealing with mystery. God is so much greater than we are. Somehow He can be in charge and give us free choice. How can He do that? I have no idea. And I've thought about it a lot and scratched my head, and that's why I have no more hair left. But we can't figure that out. Or, to use a different example, any of you recognize this item? This is a bicycle transformer. When I was a kid, I was thrilled to have one of these. This is a little gizmo that you press a button on it, and it leans over against your bike tire, and your bike tire rubs on that wheel on the top and turns the dynamo inside and produces electricity. How? It's because of the mystery, if you like, of Christian life is very much like that in many ways. Or if you, and this shows schematically how that works. You have the north-south pole rotating inside a wire coil. So the tire does the work of turning the wheel, and the result is electricity as long as the parts don't touch. Or if you have a motor, it's the same idea. It's the mystery of electromagnetism, but in the case of the motor, you put in the electricity and out comes work. But both of those operating within this mysterious electromagnetic force field are going to get to the specific psalm. Now there's, as I said, 15 psalms in the Psalms of Ascent, and all I can do is give a brief survey as I've been doing and then look at one. And that's the 129th. And it says the following: "From my earliest youth, my enemies have persecuted me. Let all Israel repeat this." Now remember, this is the people of Israel going up to Jerusalem. "From my earliest youth, my enemies have persecuted me. Let all Israel repeat this. From my earliest youth, my enemies have persecuted me, but they have never defeated me. My back is covered with cuts, as if a farmer had plowed long furrows. But the Lord is good. He has cut me free from the ropes of the ungodly." Now, that second line there is, "Let all Israel repeat this." This is a command in the Hebrew language. And I've only ever found this twice in the Bible, and it's in the Psalms of Ascent. There's another psalm that has something similar. What is to be repeated? What is to be said? In this psalm, this person is talking about suffering. They've gone through suffering. And if you want to go to Jerusalem and meet God and encounter Him properly, You need to get that baggage out. Now, somebody might say, I thought we were supposed to get our sin out. Well, actually, the next Psalm of Ascent, 130, talks about that. From the depths of despair caused by my sin, the psalmist goes on. So that's certainly included in this. But this psalm, which talks about suffering, is different and shows how deeply God understands our human psychology. Now, when you suffer because someone treats you unjustly, has anybody here ever been treated unjustly? Yeah, I'll bet you the others are just afraid they can't get their hand out from under their behind, right? We have suffered. Many people have suffered. That does not make us guilty. The Bible is very clear about that. We are not guilty because we have suffered. But what happens when we suffer and someone treats us unjustly? We get bitter and we grumble and complain. And unless you're very unusual, eventually the suffering that you go through leads to sinful attitudes and sinful behavior towards the people who made you suffer or towards some others. Now, sometimes the suffering that a person has experienced as a child comes out in sinful behavior towards their spouse when they're married later on. And the Lord understands this. He understands that the only way that your suffering can be exorcised, if you like, is to get it out. Say it to the Lord. Tell the Lord how you've suffered. Now, some people might say, oh, well, you've suffered, just forgive. Or in the broader culture, people might say, oh, you've suffered, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Good luck. My bootstraps aren't strong enough. And besides, my back is so stiff now, I have trouble getting down to my boots. Sometimes I say my feet are like a foreign country. I need a visa to go down there. Our bootstraps aren't going to work. The gospel is not about bootstraps saving yourself. But a Christianized version of that sometimes is, oh, so you've suffered? Just forgive. That's all you have to do, just forgive. The Psalms of Ascent say no. The gospel starts when you call out to God in desperation because you've suffered. That's where the gospel begins. All we do is recognize where our help comes from, which is from the Lord who made heaven and earth, and call out in desperation to him. He pours his grace and healing into us, which is like the electric motor, right? You put some electricity into the motor, and then something good comes out. But it starts with God's grace. And the only thing we do, just like the woman who had bled for so many years, she just said, if I could only touch Jesus, I'd be okay. And she reaches out and touches him. That's the cry of desperation. And that's where the gospel begins. The gospel does not begin, and Christian life does not begin with pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps or just forgiving. If the gospel was, oh, just forgive, then we'd be the source of our salvation. Because I did it. I managed to overcome my bad feelings, and I just forgave. I still hate that person, but I forgave them. No. When I call out in desperation, the grace of God comes to me, the power of God fills me, and then I have some grace to share. That's the gospel. And that's where our life as Christians begins and continues. God is always the initiator. My help comes from God who made heaven and earth. I think the worship team better come up because I'm slowly running out of things to say, and I don't want to say anything that I don't need to say. Now, my wish and my prayer for myself and for you is that we will live this way, that we will recognize, regardless of what's happened to us, the gospel begins crying out in desperation to the creator of heaven and earth, who can always help and whose energy and strength will get our motor going and get good results coming out of us. It's not our doing. All we do is call out to the one who can help. Amen.